Hey folks, Aces here. This video is an update to my very popular Baldur's Gate 3 class tier list. This video updates it for the changes that were made in patch 5 and patch 6 with the introduction of Honor Mode. So it is an Honor Mode only tier list. I find Honor Mode to be a vast improvement to Tactician, so it's pretty much all I play now. I want to keep this intro short because the video is quite long, and I hope quite interesting. I cover all of the classes and the subclasses. But one thing that needs to be said for listeners who are new to my tier lists, I always assume certain rules about the way the game is played. It's the way I play the game. I don't expect you to play the game this way, but I have to assume some things, and so I'm going to assume the rules that I use. I've linked the rules in detail in the description, but the gist of them is that I play without karmic dice, no reloading, of course, limited long rests, limited respecs, and most recently I have started playing with limited resources. Basically that means I don't craft any potions and I don't use any scrolls during combat. That's the gist of it. If you're wondering why I would assume such a restrictive rule set for my videos that are for everybody, the gist is that I have to, and this is actually the way to most accurately communicate to the most people. Alright, enough of that. Let's dive into the tier list now. Okay, we're going to dive right into the rankings now, starting with Barbarian. I'm going to put Barbarian into B tier. This is unchanged from my first video because not that much has changed with Barbarian. Well, I guess I should say things have changed with the Barbarian. It's just in comparison with its competing classes, it hasn't really changed. So let me be really clear. The immediate change for Barbarian is that it is a extra attack based striking class, and all extra attack based striking classes have been affected by what I call the Honor Mode action economy changes. These were introduced, of course, with the introduction of Honor Mode in patch 5. Basically, in Tactician mode, there are many strategies which abuse certain action economy benefits which will give you an action per round. Classic example is Haste and also Bloodlust, but there are others. These are abilities which will give you an action per round. And now if you are an extra attack-based character, you could use that action to make 2 attacks, or for fighters, 3 attacks. So if you were hasted and you had the Elixir of Bloodlust proc in a round, you'd get your standard action, that's 2 attacks. You'd get your haste action, that's 4 attacks. You get your Elixir of Bloodlust action, that's 6 attacks. You get the idea. All of that was changed with patch 5 and Honor Mode, where abilities which used to give you an action now give you an attack. So in the same situation in Honor Mode with a Barbarian, you have your standard action, which is 2 attacks. You have your haste action, which will give you now 1 attack. You have your Elixir of Bloodlust action, if that procs, it will give you 1 attack. So instead of 6 attacks, you now get 4. Hopefully you get the idea. So of course Barbarian was impacted by this, but all martial strikers pretty much across the board were impacted by this, since all of them were hit pretty much evenly. Barbarian's point in the rankings isn't changed. Now, while it has affected all attack-based martial strikers equally, it hasn't affected all roles or even all strikers equally, because you can still use that action that you get from Haste or Elixir of Bloodlust to cast a standard spell. So you can either make 1 attack with it, or you can cast a spell with it. So if you are, say, a Warlock that's using Eldritch Blast, you get your standard action to make 3 attacks with Eldritch Blast. Then you get a Haste action, which you can use to cast Eldritch Blast, make another 3 attacks. So you get the idea. They're not affected. It's just the martial attack strikers that are affected. Returning now to the Barbarian specifically, it's in a really interesting place in the meta of the game, where it starts extremely good. Barbarians get a lot of really good front-loaded abilities, so that levels 1 to roughly 5 or 6, they are easily an S tier class. The big one is Reckless Attack, which gives them at-will advantage on all of their attacks, which you can of course combine with Great Weapon Master to spike your DPR right at level 4. Then they're getting extra attack at level 5, and it's just awesome. They just get so many good features. So in the roughly Act 1 of the game, Barbarians are carries. But by the time you get a ways into Act 2, they start to fall drastically, because in Act 2, it's where you start finding your Arcane Acuity items. It's when you start getting the spells that you can reliably and consistently proc Radiating Orb on multiple targets. And basically what happens in the meta is controlling elements start becoming really, really reliable and powerful. And what that means is that durability on strikers stops being as important. And this is also simultaneously the point of the game where the main thing that Barbarians start to offer isn't more damage than their competitors, it's more durability than their competitors. Because Reckless Attack is really good when you get it. But at this point in Act 2, fighters are getting Reckless Ring. I mean, monks always had Tavern Brawler, and basically your main competitors start catching up with your DPR. Don't just catch up with your DPR, but they start to exceed it, right? Because fighters have Action Surge. I mean, Tavern Brawler is already insane damage right at level 4. Fighters are getting bonus feats. You guys get the idea. So what Barbarians offer is more durability. As soon as the meta shifts towards control being ascendant, Barbarians stop being as valuable as other classes. And then by the time you reach Act 3, like levels 8 to 12, Barbarians get almost nothing that increases their damage. What they get is a lot of features that increase their durability. Big spikes to your durability, but it's just durability overkill. Because without any sort of features which allow you to keep your allies alive or which boost your damage, you don't need all of that durability. It's not fitting into a standard team comp. And so that's what puts Barbarians for me around high B tier to low A tier. Now, if you multi-class Barbarians, this is a different story, but remember, this is a single class only tier list. On my Golden Dice run, I had a Barbarian that I had as a single class Barbarian up until level 8, and then I multi-classed them into Cleric to get a lot of utility spells. I'm going to cover that when I do a video walking through that entire run. But yeah, you can do really fun things with Barbarian if you multi-class them. Anyways, single class Barbarian, this is where I'm putting them at B tier. Said enough about that. Let's move on now to the next one, which is Bard. Bard is going into S tier, pretty much unchanged. Now, the Swords Bard was hit with the Honor Mode action economy changes just like everyone else, because Swords Bard is, of course, a extra attack abusing striker, and every attack with the Swords Bard has the potential to be 2 attacks, which is a little strange, but we'll talk about that, I think, whenever we get to the subclass section of this video. Basically, the damage of a Bard was of Swords Bard was affected, but Swords Bards were and remain good at so many other elements of the game that, yeah, overall the Bard class is unchanged. I still consider Bard as a contender for the best class in the game. It might be the best, frankly. We'll talk about that when we get to the other contender for best class. So what can I say about Bards? Honestly, Bards just do it all. They have everything you want. On its surface, Bard is a full caster class with a decent spell list. Actually, I think the Bard spell list does get overrated a little bit. The spell list on its own is pretty mid, but then you can augment it with magical secrets. And a mid spell list with magical secrets ends up being a pretty good spell list, except for your level 6 spells. And level 6 spells are actually very important. So Bards do not get probably the most important spell for Act 3, which is Globe of Invulnerability, which means for me, I end up not replacing my standard arcane caster, like my sorcerer or my wizard, with a Bard. I don't think Bards really function well that way, because you're missing out on Globe of Invulnerability. Now, some people say just use scrolls for Globe of Invulnerability, and that's fine for you, but my rules ban that, and one of the reasons why my rules ban that is because I actually value niche protection in this game. And if you're abusing scrolls, then a lot of what casters do, anyone can just do, and I don't like that. But Bards are still a pretty good, they do have a pretty good control spell list, right? They have core spells like Hold Monster, for example. You can take spells like Spirit Guardians or Glyph of Warding, etc. with magical secrets. And on top of being a full caster, they also get extra attack through their subclasses, making them the only true full caster that gets extra attack as part of their kit. And that is very important because of how it synergizes with one of the most broken item sets in the game, Helmet of Arcane Acuity with Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. I've covered these in my weapons and items video. You can find that in a playlist. I believe the Helmet of Arcane Acuity I cover in the Best Items of Act 2, and the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel I cover in the Best Items of Act 3. Anyways, you combine these items with a character that can make extra attack and also has good control spells. What you end up getting is someone who can stack up their spell DC by making attacks, which attacks are already good anyways. Then you're stacking up your spell DC, and then you're landing pretty much 95% chance control spells on enemies with a bonus action, all in the first round of combat, and it is devastatingly good. It absolutely dominates fights. So they're good strikers, they're good controllers, and they're also bards that make great support. I mean, bards have innate into their kit bardic inspiration. Now, interestingly, you end up not usually using bardic inspiration to actually support, right? Like if you pick Swords Bard, you're using it to increase your striking. If you pick College of Lore, you're using it to increase your control and to debuff enemies. But still, at least in early game, you have that as a support element. But you also have one of the best support features in the game, which is Song of Rest. Song of Rest gives you an extra short rest per long rest. And if you play like me, where minimizing long rest is how you judge how successful a run is, Song of Rest becomes an insane feature. It's extremely, extremely valuable. You just end up saving a lot of long rests because you have more short rests. It's refreshing of short rest abilities, it's healing for your composition. It's absolutely amazing. So bards end up being top tier in pretty much every role of a standard composition. They're amazing strikers if you pick Swords Bard. They're amazing controllers. They're amazing support through Song of Rest and Bardic Inspiration. Just an insanely valuable class. That is Bard. Moving on now to Cleric. I am putting Cleric also in S tier, and this is the first major change that we're getting with this video compared to my last class tier list video. Last time I had Cleric ranked in A tier. I feel pretty strongly now that they deserve to be bumped up to S. Let's talk about it. Now, when we covered the Bard, we discussed how they're pretty much good at every role, and Clerics are in a very similar boat. They bring something very valuable to the table in all three major roles of the game. First, support. I mean, it's a Cleric. You expect them to be a support class, and they absolutely deliver in this game. Clerics bring a lot of either class exclusive spells, and some of them are class exclusive spells, some of them aren't, but a Cleric kit is just the best to utilize them. Support spells. So I can just list these off, and you can go to my spell tier list videos to hear me discuss them in more depth. Clerics get Sanctuary, Aid, Bless, Hero's Feast, Create Water, Warding Bond, and I'm sure I'm missing some. Those are just some off the top of my head. Amazing support spells. Especially Hero's Feast and Aid, for me, are when I'm really pushing to optimize, these are spells that I want on my party, and a Cleric brings all of them. They also make phenomenal controllers. I mean, they get some of the best control spells in the game, spells like Command, Hold Person, Glyph of Warding, and of course Spirit Guardians. And it's important to talk about Spirit Guardians because of how well it synergizes with another one of the most overpowered item sets in the game, which is Radiating Orb items. Again, I talk about this in my items videos you can find in playlists, but basically Radiating Orb, if you have a consistent way to deal radiant damage, you can start debuffing enemy accuracy severely. And there's several ways to do this, but I still feel like the best way is just to cast Spirit Guardians on a Cleric that has a good concentration save and a high movement. So if you put Boots of Speed on a Cleric, cast Spirit Guardians, run all over the map, you're not only dealing damage to a lot of targets, you're also debuffing them a lot with the Radiating Orb item set. So great support, great controlling. What about striking? One of the common misconceptions I see is people feeling like clerics lack damage. And I guess I get it if you haven't played into Act 3, because they kind of do lack damage depending on which subclass that you pick for them. But regardless of subclass, once you get to Act 3 and you get the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, clerics are unlocked as strikers as well. Because the Staff of Cherished Necromancy gives them several free casts of level 6 upcasted inflict wounds, and that actually deals a lot of damage. Now, before today, actually, I'm recording this on Friday, and that is the day that patch 6 released, which fixed this bug. Before today, the Staff of Cherished Necromancy gave you infinite upcasted versions of inflict wounds, level 6 inflict wounds, and that made a standard cleric suddenly better than some of the more optimized striker builds in the game. And thankfully that has been nerfed because it was way too powerful. Staff of Cherished Necromancy now properly consumes charges, but still it's giving you a lot of free casts of level 6 upcasted inflict wounds, and it's still extremely good. So clerics, amazing strikers, amazing controllers, and invaluable support class. It absolutely deserves S tier in my opinion. Moving on now to Druid. I'm putting Druid in B tier, which is unchanged from my last class tier list, and that is a real shame because with patch 5, it really seemed like Druid was going to take off and find a niche in team compositions. I was flirting with the idea of putting it in high A tier and maybe even low S tier with the changes on patch 5 for Tactician mode, because if you didn't know, patch 5 allowed Druids to get the full benefits of the Tavern Brawler feat while they are shapeshifted. So Tavern Brawler allows you to add your strength modifier twice to the accuracy of your attack rolls and also to your damage. It is a very broken feat. Check out my feat tier list where I discuss it in depth. Now, ever since full release of the game, Druids got half of that benefit whenever they were wild shaped. So if you're like in an owlbear form, you attacked with your claws, it technically counts as unarmed, and with the Tavern Brawler feat, you would get double your strength bonus to your attack roll, but not to your damage. And it's good, but you really needed to go to your damage to start really competing with the top level striker builds in your wild shape form, mostly because wild shapes don't benefit from a lot of items in the game. Okay, that's awesome, except the same patch that introduced it only introduced it for Tactician mode. So in Honor mode, Druid is pretty much unchanged, which is that Druids aren't really elite at any of their primary roles. I consider Druids primarily controllers and secondarily support. As supporters, they get some good spells like Create Water, Hero's Feast, that we just talked about with the Cleric, except that Clerics also get all those spells on a full caster, and Clerics also offer way, way more than Druids. So if you're wanting those in your composition, you're going to pick a Cleric over a Druid. So the main thing they offered then is support. In particular, their spell list is built around mostly concentration spells, which either deal damage or are area control spells. But as area of controllers, they're not significantly better than sorcerers, wizards, or even warlocks. Like, take a warlock, for example. Would you prefer casting Hunger of Hadar on a warlock or anything that the druid offers? I mean, you can make an argument for some of the druid stuff, but it's not significantly better than what these other classes offer, and they also offer much more. Now, of course, shape-shifting, wild shaping gives them a lot of durability, but it's just wonky when it comes to scaling with items and feats and stuff like that. And then, of course, there is the issue of summons. A lot of people were mad because they felt like I did not acknowledge that druids are the elite summoners in this game. And so let me acknowledge it now. Druids are the elite summoners in this game. However, I consider summoning a niche composition. It can be a high-performing composition, but still ultimately niche because it builds away from a lot of the core overpowered item types in this game, I guess. Well, I guess it just doesn't synergize with them. Now, I've resolved that at some point I'm going to do a full optimized summoner playthrough. I'm going to record it. I'm going to make a video talking about it. But yeah, at this point right now, I feel pretty justified saying that while summoning is a good composition, I don't consider it the elite way to play this game. Even if it was among the elite compositions, a lot of players prefer not to play it, and they prefer to play one of the more standard striking, controlling, tanking, supporting compositions. So because I consider summoning a niche composition, that puts Druids solidly in B tier, which is that they get muscled out in standard compositions. They can have top performing builds, but they are on niche compositions. So that is why I feel justified putting Druid in B tier. We can move on now to the Fighter class. I'm going to put Fighter in A tier. It'll probably end up in low A tier, I expect. And this is a massive nerf from where it was in my last video, where I had it in S tier. So why has Fighter been downgraded? Because Fighter was hit the hardest by the honor mode action economy changes that we talked about when we discussed the Barbarian. In honor mode, while they are still strong strikers, they aren't that extra step above other strikers whenever you get to Act 3, and that is the big reason I have downgraded them. Now, with that massive nerf, why aren't they in B tier? Because while they are nerfed quite a bit, there's still a lot that is really good about the Fighter's core kit. They still get 3 attacks on their standard action. You can still use Action Surge to double that once per short rest to make 6 attacks in a round, which is crazy. And they still get that super valuable bonus feat at level 6. It's such a good tempo bonus feat, right? Because you can take Alert our Great Weapon Master at level 4, and then very quickly still get the one that you didn't take, right? So by level 6, you can have both your Great Weapon Master feat and your Alert feat, and that is very valuable, what that does for tempo. So I heard a lot of people say that Fighters were bad early game, or they get outcompeted by Barbarians and Monks, and honestly, that is not true, in my opinion. I mean, between levels 1 and 5, yeah, they probably are outcompeted by Barbarian, but around levels 6 to 8, they start to make some of that territory back. Same goes for Monk, and then by late game, they get that triple attack on their standard action, and they end up being pretty good. And I mean, Action Surge, while it's simple, is one of the best abilities in the game. So I cannot see a world where I put Fighter lower than A tier. They also have some amazing subclasses, but we'll talk about that when we get to the subclass tier list section. While they are amazing, they are no longer the elite martial striker. The elite martial striker, in my opinion, is the Monk now. With the Fighter nerfs, I don't see an argument for saying the Fighter is better than the Monk anymore. Monks are the specialized martial striker, but I still find them to be a pretty boring class. And a lot of people got mad that I said that in my last video. They were blowing me up in my comments, but I stand by it, and here is why. Monks have very little variation in their builds and what they offer to a team composition. They're extremely specialized as martial strikers, and you can't even vary them as martial strikers by giving them other weapons, because fists is head and shoulders the best way to go with a monk. So what you end up in every monk build is a class that just runs around the map and punches everything, and it's really good at that. Its punches do a lot of damage. They're extremely accurate. They're kind of the closest thing to a traditional glass cannon carry, where you can build a team composition around keeping them alive, and they will just punch everything to death and just deal so much damage and carry a fight. That is the Monk. Now, some people balked that I said all Monks do is punch, because they reasoned, what about Stunning Strike? Aren't Monks secondary controllers, right? You can stun lock people with Stunning Strike. And I was honestly surprised to hear this, because monks are not really good controllers compared to even other martial strikers, right? Like, let's think of other weapon-based strikers. Swordsbard. Are monks better controllers than Swordsbard? Not even close. Okay, that's not fair, because Swordsbards are kind of a hack because they're also full casters. What about Fighter? Are monks better controllers than fighters? No. Eldritch Knight Fighter is one of the best controllers in the game. Way, way better than just like a Stunning Strike monk. So yeah, there's no world where they're going to outclass a fighter. Okay, Eldritch Knight also gets spells. So what about Battlemaster? I mean, it's comparable even with Battlemaster, right? Both of them have short rest, refreshing control abilities. Battlemasters aren't getting stuns on their maneuvers, but they get a lot more variability in their maneuvers. So maybe Monk's a little better than a Battlemaster, but that's not the best controller build for a fighter. What about Barbarians? No, monks are not better controllers than barbarians, at least if you go Wildheart Barbarian. Wildheart Barbarians actually have a lot of cool control elements. We'll talk about that when we get to the subclasses. So if you're looking for a striker/controller, you're never putting a monk into your composition. And frankly, if you have a monk in your composition, you probably don't want to use your key on stunning strikes, because Flurry of Blows is just too efficient. It is so powerful, you pretty much just want to do it every time, because killing a target is better than stunning them. So, yeah, I don't think... I stand by my statement that monks are kind of boring, because all they do is run around and use their key and Flurry of Blows and just deal a buttload of damage. And other classes get more than that. So, anyways, there is some more for you monk stands to flame me for in the comments. We can move on now to Paladin. Paladin is staying in S tier. I think I'll put it above a Cleric, especially now that Staff of Cherished Necromancy is fixed. Yeah, Paladins are still just amazing. They offer a lot. Primarily what they offer is some of the best support abilities in the game, but they are also decent strikers. That is all unchanged from my last video. I said exactly that in my last video, and again, people flame me in the comments because it seems that most people believe Paladins are strikers, and I'm just going to tell you right now, that is completely wrong. I mean, I guess it depends on your playstyle, but think of it this way. What does a Paladin offer for striking that other classes don't get? And there's pretty much just one thing, and it's smites. Right? I mean, if you go full class Paladin, they are getting that extra, 1d8 radiant damage on their attacks. But by Act 3, an extra 1d8 radiant damage is nothing to write home about. The big thing they're getting is smites, right? And smites are good, right? They're upfront damage. They're extremely efficient from an action economy perspective because they just automatically tack on to the thing that you wanted to be doing anyways, which is attacking. And so if you spam a lot of long rests and you smite on every attack, yeah, I guess Paladins are really good strikers. But I can't do that, and I just think that's really cheap anyways. If you actually think from an resource perspective, how much damage is smite really adding? And the truth is, it's not adding that much. You will get more damage from the use of a spell slot. The value of smite is how efficient it is from an action economy perspective. And so most Paladins don't beat out other martial strikers, right? Like Fighter or Monk or Swordsbard, or even, and those are martial strikers, right? Spell Strikers, it's even worse, because Spell Strikers are some of the best in the game now, like any Eldritch Blast build that can also cast Cone of Cold and Chain Lightning. You're not out-competing them for damage. So if you're looking to slot in a class that deals damage into your team composition, Paladin is like middle of the pack, to be honest. The reason you would slot a Paladin into your team composition is for their amazing support auras. Paladins, all Paladins, get Aura of Protection, which allows them to add their Charisma bonus to every saving throw that they make, and every saving throws that their allies make if that ally is standing within 10 meters of them. And that is insanely good. If you play enough no reload runs, you realize that you can pretty effectively itemize and build to mitigate every kind of threat in the game except saving throws. Saving throws are the hardest to reliably mitigate. And so by the time you reach especially Act 3, nothing's really at a threat of ending your run except for some debilitating saving throw stun or something like that. Right? Like, even extremely high damage abilities, you have spells like Globe of Invulnerability to protect against that. But a Mind Blast, you've got nothing. And if your whole team comp gets Mind Blasted, that can actually end in a counter. So you want to build high saving throws on every character, and it's just pretty difficult to do that without a severe investment of resources unless you have a paladin in your party. Paladins give you Aura of Protection, they can cast Bless, take Cleric off of Bless duty, that's boosting your saving throws even more, and suddenly, just by slotting in a paladin, you have a reliable defense for your entire party against saving throws, and you don't even lose out that much as a striker, because as we've said, while paladins aren't top of the line strikers, they are decent strikers with extra attack and smite. And then if you pick the correct subclass for paladin, you also get some healing, you get Aura of Warding, which halves damage from spells in a 10-meter radius, and it's absolutely insane, the support capabilities of this class. And I mean, honestly, I think paladins are the #1 support class in the game, now that Twin Taste from Sorcerers has been nerfed. So, yeah, you slot in a paladin for their support capabilities, and then they're also pretty good strikers in a pinch if you have the resources to expend for it. That is paladin, that is why they are S tier. We can move on now to ranger. I am putting ranger in B tier, probably it'll end up at the bottom of B tier. Ranger was actually hit pretty hard with the honor mode action economy changes, and they weren't even in that good of a position in the first place. So the gist of ranger is that the core ranger class, like the ranger chassis, just offers basically nothing. Like, you get resistance to a few damage types, you get some good spells, like you get Hunter's Mark early game, you can get spike growth if you want to build a spike growth comp, but honestly not that much to do with your spells. You get extra attack, and that's pretty much it. So as a base class, this is probably one of the worst in the game. Luckily, it's saved a bit by their amazing subclasses, and we can talk about that a little more when we get to the subclass section of this video, but yeah, most of what rangers get is from their subclasses, and kind of the optimal ranger build, and still remains in tactician mode, was to go full class hunter for the AoE basic attacks through volley and whirlwind attack. And it was really strong, but it only clicked in Act 3, so that's why it never really got into A tier for me. But it was a top performing build once you got to Act 3, so if you just picked up Minsk in Act 3 and you built him this way, you had an amazing character. And it was basically like Fighter, except more AoE than single target. You didn't get 3 attacks in a round, but all of your attacks became AoE. So your standard action, you're AoE attacking twice, then you're hasted, you're AoE attacking twice again, you're probably killing a target, proccing Elixir Bloodlust, and then you're AoE attacking again, and it was making the most attacks in the game just spread out to a lot of targets. And that also allowed you to stack up all of the on-hit effect abilities like mental fatigue or reverberation, and suddenly you were like controlling and debuffing a lot of enemies' area of effect while simultaneously being an AoE striker, and it was really, really good, and it's been nerfed very hard because of the action economy changes, right? So that was a big bummer for the ranger. It's still decent late game, but it's just not as good as it was. And yeah, that's kind of the story of the ranger right now. We'll talk about it more with the subclasses, I guess, but I don't want to spend too much time. I just don't think a ranger competes with the other martial strikers. Like, when you compare a ranger to a paladin, because they're similar classes, right? They're like half martials, half casters. The Paladin is just so much better. It gets way more valuable abilities, and you just start to wonder, like, why does Ranger exist in this game? Like, the designers did it so dirty. Okay, moving on now to Rogue. I'm going to put Rogue in C tier, actually. That is a downgrade from where I had it in the last video I did, and it's not because much has changed about Rogue. I just thought about it more, and I realized I don't think I can justify a B tier ranking for the Rogue. Kind of. Honestly, I go back and forth on it a lot. Like, it's right on the edge of these two rankings, and we'll discuss that. First, let's just remind ourselves why the Rogue is bad. The Rogue is a martial striking class that builds around a striking strategy of dealing one very powerful attack instead of multiple attacks. Right? You get your one attack, and you stack up sneak attack dice on it. The idea is that attack on its own is supposed to deal enough damage to compete with fighters and rangers and barbarians and monks that are attacking multiple times in a round. Now, fundamentally, that is a very poor strategy, both just in 5e games in general, because the designers of 5th edition, I feel like, drastically overestimated the value of a die 6 sneak attack dice. I mean, a die 6 sneak attack dice is adding 3.5 damage to your attack on average for every 2 levels that you take into Rogue, and it just does not keep up. Just for a quick comparison, you need 6 levels of Rogue to get enough sneak attack dice that your sneak attack is averaging roughly around the same amount of extra damage that Great Weapon Master gives you, right? The plus 10. You need 3 die 6 to average roughly around the same amount as a plus 10 flat. Okay, so that's 6 levels of Rogue, but you still only get that on 1 attack. And by 6 levels, the fighter or the ranger or the barbarian is dealing that on their extra attack. So now if they're hitting both attacks, they're getting plus 20 to their damage with Great Weapon Master, and sneak attack is giving you around a plus 10 to 11. And so you can see it just gets outpaced. And the ability to add more attacks through haste and Elixir of Bloodlust just outpaces this entire strategy. And I haven't done the math, but off the top of my head, I suspect sneak attack dice needs to be around a 1d10 to really keep up with extra attack based classes. So the fact that it's a 1d6 is just not good enough. But then you factor in what Larian has added to the base 5e game, and Rogue is even out worse because a lot of the really good strategies in Larian's item design function around stacking abilities on hit. So think of things like Radiating Orb, or Mental Fatigue, or Reverberation, or Arcane Acuity. All of these are strategies which stack on hit. So if you're a class that only gets 1 hit in a round, roughly, you're out of luck. So you factor that all in, and Rogue is just at a disadvantage. And then there's the fact that all it does is striking. Rogues are strikers. They're not controllers. They're not supporters. They offer nothing in that regard. Like, take controlling. 2 of the Rogue subclasses give you nothing for control. The Arcane Trickster gives you a bit, but it is not a good controller in this game, because controlling in this game is mostly about Arcane Acuity. It's like 80% Arcane Acuity, and Rogues offer nothing in their kit to quickly stack up Arcane Acuity. And support, what do they offer for support? Nothing, unless you count being good at skills as a kind of support. I mean, maybe you can do it that way. I mean, sure, Rogues are good at skills, but skills aren't important enough in a standard honor mode run that you want to have a whole 1/4 of your composition dedicated to being good at skills. And I mean, even if you did, you would probably still just go Bard, right? Because Bards do that on top of everything else. So Rogues are a singly oriented towards dealing damage, and they don't even deal that much damage. So they have basically nothing, and that's why I feel like they belong in C tier. Now that I've said all that, let me give the argument for why I kind of still think they might belong in B tier, because remember, the difference between B tier and C tier in my tier list system is that a C tier class has no top performing builds, and a B tier class has top performing builds on niche compositions. I can think of two high performing builds for the rogue. The first is kind of like a psychic assassin build, and remember, we're restricting ourselves to single class here. A single class assassin build, if you get the ring that allows you to use the Shadow Blade in Act 2, and then you get the Resonating Stone at the very end of Act 2, which makes targets vulnerable action economy free to psychic damage, you can do this weird mathematical thing where all of your sneak attack dice is now dealing psychic damage. You're doubling that against targets because they're vulnerable due to their Resonating Stone. And then you double that again because of the guaranteed crit that assassins get, and you're doubling the double. It's layers of multipliers, and you start getting into very, very high damage averages. I mean, we're talking close to one-shot bosses late game, but it all depends on a surprise round, right? There are some fights where it's difficult to get surprise, and you're not durable, so you probably want to do it on a Dark Urge run where you can get that cloak that makes you invisible whenever you kill a target, and that's all you're offering to a party. So while it is a high-performing striker build, I still probably wouldn't take it over other striker builds. The second high-performing build I can think of is just a greater invisibility abusing build, where you invest a lot into being very good at stealth rolls. Rogues are great for that. And then you cast greater invisibility, and now your rogue is basically untargetable. It's sneak attacking every round, and it avoids all aggro. That's very cool. Anyways, if people want to maintain that rogue is still B tier, I can see that. I think rogue is C tier. Anyone who thinks rogue is higher than B tier is probably overrating skills and skirmishing in this game, in my opinion. Let's move on now to Sorcerer. I am going to put Sorcerer in still the best class in the game. I go back and forth between maybe Bard being the best or maybe Sorcerer being the best, and what I've arrived at is that Swords Bard is probably the best class-subclass combo in the game, but as a class, if we're just talking about class tier list, Sorcerer is the best, and that's why I'm going to put it here. We'll get into more nuance when we get to these subclasses. But here is the situation that the Sorcerer is in. It really does everything, and it does everything at a top level. It has a pretty good support kit, mostly through Twin Spell and Globe of Invulnerability. With the Twin Spell meta magic, you can Twin Haste. It's been severely nerfed, of course, but it still is pretty good. I mean, it still has a lot of defensive bonuses to your party. It still doubles your party movement, which can be really good. So Twin Haste, amazing. You can twin Drake Throat Glaive. This is something I didn't realize when I made my last tier list, but twinning the Drake Throat Glaive buff is really cool and allows you to do some very interesting things with builds. And then it has Globe of Invulnerability, one of the most valuable and important spells in the late game. So that's the support kit of a Sorcerer. And then we get to controlling, which is probably its best role, one of the best controllers in the game. Early game, it gets Heightened Spell, which is very good before you get your Arcane Acuity items. Once you get your Arcane Acuity items, Sorcerers get Scorching Ray, which means they can instantly stack Arcane Acuity and cast spells like Hold Monster, which they get, Sleet Storm, which they get. And then finally, we get to striking, and Sorcerers are still phenomenal strikers, both in a Nova sense. Like, I think everyone understands they're great strikers in a Nova sense with spells like Cone of Cold, Chain Lightning. By the way, you can no longer, as of today with the introduction of patch 6, you can no longer twin spell Chain Lightning, which I think was good. That was way too powerful of a combo, but honestly, you didn't need it. It was kind of overkill, to be honest. Like, a simple Create Water with a Cone of Cold, when you fully stacked Arcane Acuity, that is enough to clear a lot of the fights that people were using that twin Chain Lightning on, like the House of Grief, for example. I'm going to show this in the footage when I release my Golden Dice run, but if you kite backwards in the House of Grief onto the steps, the enemies will cluster at the bottom of the steps, and then you can hit high efficiency Cone of Colds, and if you have enough Arcane Acuity stacked, enemies can't get to you because they'll just slip on the ice. So that's enough. You don't actually need to twin cast Chain Lightning. I've gotten distracted here, but what I'm trying to say is Cone of Cold, Chain Lightning, wet targets, really good Nova striking. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is sorcerers are actually pretty good round-to-round strikers with Eldritch Blast. And I just mentioned this in passing in my last video, and it confused a lot of people, so I'm going to go over it in a little more detail now. Sorcerers with Eldritch Blast are honestly pretty good strikers without even spending a spell slot. And it confused people because isn't Eldritch Blast like a Warlock thing? And I mean, kind of, but also no, not really. Any class can get Eldritch Blast if they spend a feat either on Magic Initiate Warlock or Spell Sniper. You can go to my feat tier list where I discuss those in more detail. But both of those spells will get you Eldritch Blast, and it's worth doing on several classes, but especially the Sorcerer, because Sorcerers are already Charisma classes. So you can get the Potent Robe, and it'll allow you to add your Charisma modifier to the damage of each ray in that blast. Potent Robe Sorcerer is basically the same as Agonizing Blast, Eldritch Blast on a Warlock. You just needed to spend a feat to get it. And I mean, sure, Agonizing Blast stacks with the Potent Robe, and you're not getting Repelling Blast, so there's always some advantages that Warlocks maintain with Eldritch Blast, but that doesn't mean it's bad for Sorcerers. There's also a ton of other items that just stack so well with Eldritch Blast. For example, Callous Glow Ring and Coruscation Ring, that's going to be adding an extra 2 radiant damage to every ray of your Eldritch Blast. So now with Potent Robe and Coruscation Ring, Callous Glow Ring, you're looking at around +7 to 8 damage on each ray. And remember, it's 3 rays per cast. That's already getting into respectable damage range. And then on top of that now, with the Callous Glow Ring and the Coruscation Ring, you're also stacking Radiating Orb with each ray. Awesome. Factor in Spell Sparkler or Marco Crusher with the Boots of Stormy Clamor and the Gloves of the Belligerent Sky, and now you're also stacking Reverberation on targets with each ray. And Reverberation not only debuffs enemy saving throws, it also potentially knocks them prone. So you have a control element, you're lowering their accuracy, you're lowering their saving throws, you're knocking them prone, you're also doing respectable damage, and none of this is costing a spell slot. And that's really good for Sorcerers, because Sorcerers want to find efficient uses of their actions that don't require a spell slot, so they can save up those spell slots and go completely Nova in the House of Grief, twin casting Cone of Cold on wet targets and stuff like that. So altogether, Sorcerers just make really efficient like tempo casters for their ability to kind of round over round, do good damage with Eldritch Blast, and then just go completely Nova on boss fights, and it is extremely good. By the way, a unique advantage that Sorcerers get for Eldritch Blast builds is they get Quicken Spell, which allows them to cast Eldritch Blast on a bonus action. And because casting Eldritch Blast is the equivalent to making 3 attacks, it's kind of like taking your bonus action and turning it into an extra action, which is very, very good. But you get the idea. Sorcerers are actually great strikers. So we've been through every role now. They're insane at support, they're insane at control, they're insane at striking. Some of the best top performing builds at all 3 roles. I just don't see why we shouldn't say Sorcerers are the best class in the game. Alright, moving on now. Next up is Warlock. It's convenient to cover Warlock after Sorcerer because they're very similar. Actually, let's move Warlock up. I'm going to move it to probably the high end of A tier. I think they're probably better than Monks. Warlock is a really good class, and when you're playing one, it feels like an S tier class. Ultimately, though, I feel like it's not, because all of the things that it does well, another class does better. We'll talk about that in a bit. What does a Warlock do? Well, it's kind of a full caster class, right? It has Pact Magic, which is a little worse than full casting, but, you know, it's an honorary full caster, we'll just put it that way. Then, of course, it has Eldritch Blast, and it's one of the best classes for Eldritch Blasting because of Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast. It has some great spells for Area of Control, like Hunger of Hadar, amazing. And, I mean, yeah, that's kind of what you got in the core class. You've got a round-over-round great class for Eldritch Blast, then you've got some good control spells like Hold Monster or Hunger of Hadar, and you can Repelling Blast targets back into Hunger of Hadar. Awesome. Or, alternatively, you can go like an Acuity Gish build, with the Warlock, because with Pact of the Blade, they also get extra attack, and that makes them like kind of like the Bard, right? Where they can get extra attack on kind of a full caster build, and you can do all of the tricks with the Helmet of Arcane Acuity and the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel that Bards can do. So they're kind of like a Sorcerer, and they're kind of like a Bard, and both of those classes are amazing, and that means Warlock is amazing, except, and this is the reason why it's an A tier for me, it's not better than a Sorcerer in like a caster Eldritch Blast build, because sure, it might be better at Eldritch Blasting. I mean, it definitely is round over round. The only edge that the Sorcerer has is Quicken Spell. So yeah, it's better at Eldritch Blasting than the Sorcerer, but it doesn't have everything else that the Sorcerer has, like Meta Magic and Globe of Invulnerability. So if you're wanting like an Eldritch Blast based control build, you're probably going to go Sorcerer in your team composition over Warlock, right? Okay, but what if you wanted to go the Acuity Gish route? Well, it's not going to be better than a Swords Bard, right? If you want that in your team composition, you're going to go Swords Bard every time. You're never going to go Warlock. So while it's really good, has some very good builds, it's competing with the two hands down best classes in the game at everything that it does. And so for that reason, it's downgraded into A tier for me. And finally, that brings us to the last class, which is Wizard. Wizard's going into A tier. I could definitely see it being S tier. I flirted with putting it into S tier myself. So yeah, let's just talk about that. What does a wizard have? I mean, a wizard is a lot like a sorcerer. And so you can think of it as being pretty much the same as a sorcerer. And when you think of it that way, it's probably the best class in the game, right? Like sorcerer, wizard, roughly the same. Why would I put it in A tier and sorcerer in S tier? Well, first let's just talk about what it has that distinguishes it from the sorcerer. First, it has a better spell list. A lot of people think the sorcerer spell list and the wizard spell list is the same, but that is not true. They have a lot of the same spells, but wizards get other spells that the sorcerer doesn't get that are amazing. I mean, some of them, like Glyph of Warding, for example, wizards get that and sorcerers just don't for some reason. But then there's also several unique spells that you get in Act 3 that you scribe from scrolls, in particular Curriculum of Strategy, that are just really, really good, and only wizard or wizard multi-classes can get those. And then finally, you just get more spells known than a sorcerer, and you get more casts of those spells because of Arcane Recovery, a very easy to overlook ability because you get it early on, but it scales with every level, so on a full class wizard, you're getting just insane value from it late game. So they're kind of just the best spellcaster in the game, have the most spells cast, and the best spell list in the game. They also make great Eldritch Blasters, just like sorcerers. They don't have Quicken Cast, but like if you go Evocation Wizard and you take the Spell Sniper feat, by late game you're adding your intelligence to every ray of Eldritch Blast, but you actually free up your robe slot to do it, so you can get some of the other really good robes, or maybe a really good piece of armor. Or you can still go Potent Robe if you invest a little bit into Charisma, and now you're adding both your Charisma and your Intelligence to every ray. And they make pretty respectable Eldritch Blasters for round over round damage as well. So they're just really good. What they don't have compared to Sorcerers is they don't have Meta Magic, so they can't do all of the Twinned and Quicken Cast shenanigans. They don't have an innate Constitution save proficiency, which is a big bummer. You'll probably want to invest a feat to get that Constitution save proficiency, so they're like a feat down from the Sorcerer. And then finally, they're Intelligence-based instead of Charisma-based, which can be... I mean, Intelligence is just the worst attribute in the game. There's just not a lot of uses for it. Whereas Charisma is like one of the best casting attributes in the game because of your ability to talk your way through Act 2 encounters. Now, there's enough charisma-based classes that you're probably going to have someone on your party that can do that, but still it is a minor problem for the wizard. And so ultimately, I feel like wizards are just almost as good as sorcerers, but still worse. So why would you pick a wizard over a sorcerer? You're probably just not going to do it, and so they're kind of in the same situation as the Warlock, and that's why it's an A tier for me. But there's a lot of people who prefer wizards over sorcerers, in which case this would be the situation for them. And honestly, I think this is a respectable opinion. Maybe Wizard's the best class in the game, and Sorcerer is an A tier. Anyways, I'm just trying to show you that with the way I do my tier lists, a lot of people find this confusing. But the fundamental question I ask in my tier list is, why would I take this class? What are they doing on a team composition? And so when you have two classes that compete for the same role, whichever one's better is going to be a tier above. And so even though Wizard's a very good class, like there's an argument in a different criteria that's an S tier, because I believe the Sorcerer is better, that puts the Wizard in A tier. And that is it for my base class rankings. Not that much has changed from my last tier list, just in terms of rankings, right? Like Fighter got downgraded, Cleric got upgraded, and Rogue got downgraded. But I think a lot has changed in terms of my reasoning, and I have learned a lot of the game since. So this is my base class rankings for Honor Mode. Now let's go over to subclasses. All right, we're shifting over to the subclasses now, and this video is already longer than I was expecting it to be. So I guess I'll have to go through this quickly, which is too bad because I was disappointed in my last video. I thought that my subclass rankings were pretty haphazard, and I want to fix that now. So we're just going to think through this. I'm not going to explain as much, but hopefully the rankings will be an improvement. So let's start now with the Barbarian. Barbarian has 3 subclasses. Remember, I put Barbarian into B tier, so we can start them out there. The 3 subclasses for Barbarian are Berserker, Wildheart, and Wild Magic. I would put them probably in this order for rankings, but Wild Magic I expect is going to end up quite a bit lower than Berserker and Wildheart. Berserker is a striker variant of the Barbarian. Its main feature is that it can use a bonus action to attack with a stacking accuracy debuff, but you can actually bypass the accuracy debuff if you use that attack to throw a weapon. So Berserkers end up being pretty good for throw builds. And what I like about the Berserker is that it adds damage to the Barbarian base class. And as we talked about, the main problem with the Barbarian base class is they lack damage as a striker. Wildheart Barbarians are good because they also add something to the Barbarian base class. But instead of more striking, they're adding a control element. I think it's pretty well established now that the optimal way to build Wildheart is to go the Tiger route, where you can make targets bleed, and then you're also maiming them, which brings their movement to 0. And if you can knock them down, which you can very easily do, for example, with a Eldritch Blast build that has Boots of Stormy Clamor or Gloves of the Belligerent Sky, your Reverberation will knock them prone, and then they end up losing a turn, because if you're both prone and have 0 movement, you're not able to stand up, and if you're not able to stand up in BG3, you're not able to take actions, and your turn is cancelled. So a controller Wildheart Barbarian is actually very interesting, and it's cool because you start out being a strong striker, and just as the time that controlling starts becoming really important in the game is simultaneously where the Wildheart Barbarian starts being a controller, and you just stack up even more control. So that's a very cool subclass. Wildheart Barbarian adds a support element to the Barbarian subclass, but the support element isn't that good. The best thing that it's giving is that you can just hand one of your spellcasters more spell slots. That's actually very good, but it's not enough to really distinguish it compared to other support classes. Like, it's not better than Song of Rest, it's not better than anything that the Paladins are giving you. And yeah, so I think it's probably going to end up in the low end of B tier. Moving on now to the Bard, because we got to go quickly. Remember, I put Bard in S tier. So there are 3 Bard subclasses, but realistically, there's only 2. There's College of Swords Bard. I think this one is going to be the best subclass combination in the game. Because this is the subclass of Bard, which gets extra attack, and then it also gets its unique Blade Flourishes, which allow you to expend your Bardic Inspiration to basically turn your attacks into 2 attacks with Slashing Flourish. So it's just doubling the value of your attacks if you expend a resource, but it's a resource that refreshes on a short rest. It is honestly too good. I recommend that Larian consider nerfing it. But yeah, this is a class that just does everything in the game. It is one of the best controllers in the game, one of the best strikers in the game, one of the best supports in the game through Song of Rest. It's a charisma class, so it's talking its way through Act 2. It is just the main character of Baldur's Gate 3. And then that brings us to the second one, which is Lore Bards. Lore Bards are also very good, but they have more of an emphasis on support and control. The big things that Lore Bard are getting is an extra and earlier level magical secrets. They're getting it at level 6 as well as at level 10. And then they get Cutting Words, which allows them to use their bardic inspiration to debuff enemies. You can debuff enemy attack rolls, potentially making an attack miss, the same as like Warding Flare. Or you can debuff enemy saving throws, which is honestly too good. I mean, if this was a standard game without a lot of the Larry and Cheese items, this might be one of the best classes in the game. But the fact that Arcane Acuity exists means you're usually getting a 95% chance to land control spells on enemies without Cutting Words. But I mean, that said, it is rare to have max Arcane Acuity on every controller in your party. I at least usually run 3 characters that can control. And like I'll have a Gish build, I'll have an Arcane build, and then I'll have my Cleric. And the Gish build's going to be using Helmet of Arcane Acuity. My Arcane build is usually the one that I give the Hat of Fire Acuity to, and that means my Cleric is usually lacking in Arcane Acuity. And then if you have a Lore Bard or some kind of Lore Bard multiclass, your Cutting Words can really help that Cleric land their spells. So yeah, Lore Bard's still amazing as like a support and control element of the Bard. And then finally we get the Valor Bard, which I'm actually going to move straight into RP tier. Now, it's actually an S tier class because it's still a Bard and it gets extra attack, making it an insane Gish. It is an S tier class. If you play one, it's going to carry your composition, except it's not going to carry as good as the Swords Bard in any way. It's completely outclassed by the Swords Bard, so it's going into RP tier because there's never a reason to pick the Valor Bard over the Swords Bard. Alright, I just want to make my kind of reasoning clear here. Okay, moving on now, we get to Cleric. There is a lot of Cleric subclasses. Remember, we put Cleric into S tier, so we're going to start. Is that all of them? No, I'm missing one. Here it is. Okay, Clerics are in an interesting position where I think even though they have more than 3 subclasses, they functionally have 3 subclasses that are just better than all the others, and those are these 3 right here. It is Light Cleric, that's this one, Life Cleric is this one, and Tempest Cleric is this one. These 3 each have their own unique niche that add to the Cleric base class and are just better than the 4 others. So I'm actually going to downgrade these 4 into A tier, and we're going to start by talking about the actual S tier Clerics. Starting with Life Cleric. I still think Life Cleric is probably the best, although there's a reason to take Tempest or Life over it. Life Cleric gets several things. First, its spell list. It gets a lot of bonus spells that augment the already good Cleric spell list a lot. They're giving it a lot of damage spells like Scorching Ray, Fireball, Wall of Fire, and you'll notice all of these are fire spells too, which means you can actually slap your Hat of Fire Acuity on your Light Cleric and make it your Fire Acuity controller, and it's really, really good at that. It also gets an insane Channel Divinity, one of the best Channel Divinities of the game. It's a massive AoE radiant damage nuke spell. I mean, the damage isn't massive, but the damage is definitely respectable, and it's in a very wide AoE, and it is radiant damage, which means it works really well with the Radiating Orb item sets, which you already want to go on a Cleric anyways. And then finally, the Light Cleric gets the Warding Flare ability, which imposes disadvantage on enemies that attack it on a reaction, resource free, and by mid to late game, you can also do that on enemies within, I think, 30 feet of you, and it's really good. It mitigates a lot of damage just by making attacks that would hit miss, or making attacks that would crit just hit, or even potentially miss. Very, very good. So the combination of all those things just makes Light Cleric stand out as the best in my opinion. But there's reasons to pick these other ones. Let's go Life Cleric. Man, Life Cleric has been a carry for both of my honor mode runs that I've done so far, because the main thing that the Life Cleric gets is a very powerful Channel Divinity, which is an AoE heal that scales very highly with your level. An AoE heal early game, which refreshes on a short rest, gives you a lot of value from the ring, the Whispering Promise ring, or the Hellrider gauntlets, which give you potent buffs on heal. So it's really good for that early game. It's also just a short rest refreshing big AoE heal, and it just gives you a lot of hit points, scaling really well into late game. Because not only does it scale with cleric level, you also get more cast per short rest with level, and by late game, if you have that one necklace, I think you're getting 3 per short rest, and it's just too much healing. It's overwhelming healing, and it just allows you to take less long rests because you're always maximum health. It also has like this oh crap factor, where if you make a mistake and you end up taking a lot of damage and several enemies are downed, you just heal up basically to full in a round or two. So Life Cleric is awesome for that. They don't really have a good spell list though, so that is a pretty big weakness for them. Moving on now to Tempest Cleric. Tempest Cleric is the more offensive oriented version of the Cleric. It's kind of like the Light Cleric where it adds offensive spells, but they are thunder and lightning oriented spells, which is good for 2 reasons. One, because you can double them against wet targets, making this the de facto Cleric for wet blasting compositions. And then also because you can actually get some value out of the Hat of the Thunder Lord, I think it's called, which is basically the Hat of Fire Acuity, but for thunder damage. There aren't really any good classes to utilize this except for kind of the Tempest Cleric. So these are the 3 best. Now if we just go over the 4 bottom tier ones, I would probably rank them in this order, something like this. But it doesn't really matter. All of them are still very good because they're all still clerics. But moving on to Druid now. So remember, Druids were in B tier. There are 3 Druid subclasses: Land, Circle of the Land, Circle of the Moon, and Circle of Spores. I would probably rank them in this order, although I could see this being okay. Honestly, they're all pretty even between the 3. So let's talk about why I prefer Circle of the Land. The big thing that Circle of the Land gets is a lot of spells added to the Druid spell list, which is important for Druids because I think their biggest problem is their spell list. They also get Natural Recovery. Natural Recovery just allows you to cast more spells, and it scales extremely well with levels, and that is amazing. It's very simple, but that is why I like Circle of Land the best. Now, Circle of Spores could be the best, I think, because they are the best at what Druids are best at, which is summoning. Circle of Spores are amazing summoners, and especially late game, you can get the Armor of the Spore Keeper, which allows you to get a free haste spore cloud per long rest, which is amazing. There used to be a hack for this where you basically got it as an unlimited resource, but that has been fixed as of today with patch 6 is what I am reading. I haven't tested it, obviously. I haven't had time, but that is what people are saying, and that would make sense because it was way too powerful. It needed to get patched. My problem with the Circle of Spores is that a lot of its features are built around an alternate use of your wild shaping that is never actually better than wild shaping. So it feels like so many of its features are just wasted, and that's kind of my problem. And then finally we get to Circle of the Moon. Circle of the Moon is the wild shape augmented version of the Druid. Its main features are that it can wild shape on a bonus action, and that it gets several unique wild shape forms. For the most part, none of these wild shape forms are better than just wild shaping into an owlbear. And any of the Druid classes can just do that. So that's the main hit against Moon Druid for me. Now, by the very end of the game, you can shapeshift into elemental myrmidons, and those actually can be better than owlbear, especially if you build a composition around them. And they're very, very fun. So I'm not overlooking those. They are good. But are they good enough? Are they better enough than just a standard owlbear in a standard composition? that they muscle out what the land druid gives you or the spore druid gives you. I don't think so. So that's my reason for putting Moon Druid as the worst of the three, but they're all pretty equal. It doesn't really matter what you pick. Moving on now to the Fighter. Fighter has 3 subclasses. We put the Fighter in A tier. These subclasses are Eldritch Knight Fighter, Battlemaster Fighter, and Champion Fighter. We're going to start out by moving Champion Fighter into RP tier. My opinion has not changed on this. I don't think the Champion Fighter subclass offers anything that would incentivize you to pick it over the other fighter subclasses. I don't mean that it's actually RP tier. It's probably A tier because it's still a fighter. You're still getting triple attack late game, you're still getting action surge. All of those are enough to keep it in A tier. I'm putting it in RP tier because there's no reason to pick this subclass over the other subclasses. What the champion gives you is pretty much an extra crit. It also gives you an extra fighting style, but it gives it to you pretty late, and fighting styles aren't even that good early game, much less as a feature late game. So the big thing is that you're lowering your crit by 1. So this is a staple for multi-class crit fishing builds, but remember, we're not talking about multi-classing here. Fighters aren't good crit fishers. You usually want to multi-class into like Thief or Paladin if you're crit fishing. And crit fishing multi-class builds aren't even that good of a strategy. They're fun because you get to see the big numbers, but if you actually do the math, they're not that good. And you can still build around crits without crit fishing, because you can guarantee crits through Paralyzed Condition or the Sleep Condition. You also don't need Champion to crit fish. Most of the abilities which lower your crit chance are through items, and any fighter can do them. So this subclass is just giving you a -1 to your crit chance. That's not better than maneuvers. It's not better than anything that Eldritch Knight gives you, so that is why Champion is in RP tier. So if we talk about the actual fighter subclasses, Eldritch Knight gets a lot of really cool things. The main thing it gets is late game. When you attack a creature, you will impose disadvantage on saving throw spells or abilities that you use against it. And that can be really good for a control Gish build, but also it's really, really good when you're stacking on-hit effects on your attacks, either through Reverberation or Encrusted with Frost. I always do an Encrusted with Frost build, with Eldritch Knights, where you're suddenly just freezing targets. And you usually want some Reverberation there as well through Boots of the Stormy Climber. I'm going to make a build video on this. I've been talking about it for a long time, just haven't got around to it yet. But I actually value Eldritch Knights very highly. I used to consider them one of the best classes in the game, and they still probably are in Tactician, but even in Honor Mode, I probably rank them high A tier. Battlemasters are the more standard fighters. They get some maneuvers, which are very good and very versatile. I will probably keep them in the lower end of A tier. Moving on to the Monk, there are 3 subclasses of Monk. They are Way of the Open Hand, that's this one, Way of Shadows, this one, Way of the 4 Elements, which is this one. Now, realistically, the always best subclass to pick is the Way of the Open Hand. I'm probably going to rank it, like, I don't know, probably up here somewhere. And so we could definitely just put these 2 in RP tier, because Way of the Open Hand is just superior to them in pretty much every way. Because remember that the thing that a monk does is striking, and this is the best striking monk, and these are the worst striking monks. End of story. However, I am kind of interested in Way of the Shadow, to be frank. There's some things I'd like to experiment with it. It can fit in kind of niche, like darkness using comps. So there's a reason to pick it in some niche comps over Way of the Hand. So I'm going to put it here for A tier. I'm probably going to leave Way of the 4 Elements in RP tier. There are builds where Way of the 4 Elements is good, when you use the Fangs of the Fire Snake to stack up Fire Acuity with the Hat of Fire Acuity, but those are all multi-class builds. As a single class build, I don't think there's ever a reason to pick it, so I'm leaving it in RP tier. Next up, we get to Paladin. Paladins were in S tier. There are 4 Paladin subclasses. There are the Oath of the Ancients Paladin, the Oath of Devotion Paladin, the Oath of Vengeance Paladin, and the Oathbreaker Paladin. I would probably rank them in this order. Oath of Ancients is the best, in my opinion. It is the support and healing variant of the Paladin, and as I've said, I think Paladins are primarily for support, so if you're slotting in a Paladin into your composition, you're probably wanting Oath of the Ancients. However, these other subclasses of Paladin do offer a lot of extra damage in some very interesting ways. So the Oath of Vengeance gets a lot of mobility. It actually forsakes auras. I mean, it still gets aura protection, but that's the only aura it gets. And then it gets some channeled divinities, which give it advantage on its attacks, which can be very good for great weapon master builds. I think this is probably the best striker variant of the Paladin. It also gets some good spells, like it gets Hunter's Mark early game, it gets Hold Person, it gets Haste, all of those very valuable for the Paladin spell list. The Oath Breaker Paladin, this one is super weird and cool. It gets this ability Aura of Hate at 7th level, which allows it to add its Charisma modifier to its damage, and to the damage of all weapon-wielding fiend and undead summons in your party. Now, that is a very niche category of summon. There's a lot of undead summons you can have which don't use weapons, they just attack with their fists or claws. They don't get the benefits. There isn't a whole lot of fiends, but yeah, if a fiend isn't attacking with a weapon, it's not getting the benefits. But even without the summons, it's still adding your charisma modifier to your damage, as well as to all your saving throws, which is pretty cool. It also gets some really good channel divinities that can control undead. They're very interesting if you can get creative with them. So that is Oathbreaker. And the worst, I think, is Oath of Devotion, but it's not so bad that it's there's no reason to ever pick it. Its big thing is that very early in the game, it gets a Channel Oath, which allows you to add your Charisma modifier to your attack rolls, and it's very good on a Great Weapon Master build, especially if you pre-buff with it, which I don't allow in my rule set, and that's the big reason why it's kind of low in my rankings. Still, that ability is really good, especially early game. So these are the Paladin rankings. Moving on now to Ranger. We have Ranger at the bottom of B tier. Rangers get 3 subclasses. They are Hunter Ranger, Beastmaster Ranger, and Gloomstalker Ranger. If we're just talking single class Rangers, as we are, this is the rankings I would put these 3 subclasses. Hunter is probably the best because it scales very well into late game with Volley and Whirlwind Attack. We talked about those a bit. It also gets multi-attack defense, which is a very often overlooked defensive ability. It is quite good, and that's what makes the Hunter good, in my opinion. Beastmaster is a close second. It gets a very cool animal summon. The animal summons have lots of interesting abilities, and you can make some pretty cool builds around it. Also, the summons benefit from your Hunter's Mark, just like you do, and it creates, I think, an interesting build, especially for piercing damage compositions that build around the Ballast Armor or a Bloodlust, where you're doubling piercing damage. Hunter's Mark gives you more piercing damage, and now you're also getting it on your summons. Some of your summons can also summon more summons that all do piercing damage as well, and it's interesting for that. But either way, it's a really good summon that you get once per short rest. That's good for the entire game. And then finally we get to Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker is the best subclass if you're multi-classing because it has a really, really powerful front-loaded ability. But then everything it gets after that, after level 3, is decent but not great. And ultimately as a single class, I don't think it competes with Hunter or Beastmaster. It is the king of multi-classing though. Moving on now to Rogue. 3 subclasses of Rogue. We've got Thief, we've got Assassin, and we've got Arcane Trickster. I'm actually going to bump Thief up to B tier because I think it is actually a pretty good class-subclass combo. Yeah, it doesn't belong in C tier because the main thing that the Thief gets is that at level 3, you get to make a second bonus action. And if you can get a good weapon in your offhand and something which allows you to add your dexterity modifier to the damage of that attack, then you actually have a competitive striker because you're making a lot of attacks just on your bonus action, right? Like attacking twice on your bonus action is similar to attacking twice with a single action. And then if you can use your action to make a sneak attack, the damage actually is respectable. So I think Thief Rogue is the highest. There's lots of interesting builds you can do with Rogue. And then of course, Rogues are the king of multiclassing. Next up is Assassin. As I talked about, Assassin has a pretty good single class build. So that is definitely why I rank it higher than Arcane Trickster. Arcane Trickster is really just the worst. It's giving you basically nothing in the grand scheme of things. So that is Rogue. Gotta go quick now. Moving on to Sorcerer. 3 Sorcerer subclasses. We got Draconic, we've got Tempest, and we have Wild Magic. I would rank them in this order. I'm actually going to downgrade Wild Magic probably to around here, because unlike when I made my last video, I am not nearly as impressed with Wild Surges as I used to be. I think as I've mastered the full release of this game more, I just feel like I do not need Wild Magic variability in my composition. I've also really pushed myself to reduce rests even more, and when you're really trying to cut down on rests, you just don't want the RNG of Wild Surges. A bad Wild Surge can really turn a fight south, and it's not so south that you risk dying, but it's south enough that you might end up using a rest to recover, and that's enough to downgrade Wild Magic Sorcerer for me. So what you really get are these 2 sorcerers is the best. Draconic Sorcerer gets some, I don't know, pretty whatever abilities. Like one of them boosts your armor class if you're wearing robes, which you do on a sorcerer. Even if you have light armor proficiency, you're probably going potent robe on your sorcerer, right? So a little bit of extra armor class is good, and then it allows you to add your charisma modifier to the damage of a certain element. People usually go fire for this one, and I do recommend fire, especially if you're going to go Eldritch Blast. But I also think ice is a good option. You can start getting pretty high value out of Ray of Frost. It's not as good as Eldritch Blast, but it's pretty decent, and you don't need to spend a feat on it. So both of those are good options. The main thing that makes Draconic Sorcerer good is it is the only sorcerer that can get Shovel in the early game. All wizards can get Shovel, all warlocks can get Shovel, but only the Draconic subclass of the sorcerer can get Shovel. That's the big reason why I prefer Draconic Sorcerer. Tempest Sorcerer is also pretty good. What it adds to the sorcerer is more spells, which is very important for sorcerers. And it also gives you some kind of lightning themed abilities, which are good, but not great. Okay, that is Sorcerer. Moving on now to Warlock. Where did I have Warlock? I think I had them here. There are 3 Warlock subclasses. They are Fiend Pact, Great Old One Pact, and Fey Pact. I would put them in this order. I like Fiend the best. They have the best bonus spells. They get Scorching Ray. They have the best bonus spells. They also get some very good durability abilities. Great Old One Pact gets a really good ability at level 2, Mortal Reminder, where whenever you crit, you fear enemies in an AoE. It's a lot of just free control from critting, and you can make some very cool builds out of it. I love it for multi-class. It still has its niche as a full class. I prefer the Fiend, but Great Old One is very close behind it. And then Fey is kind of the worst Warlock in my opinion, but its abilities are not bad, and it is still a Warlock. There's reasons to pick it. I'm going to put it right here. And that brings us to the last class of the game, which is Wizard. Wizards get a ton of subclasses, so there's a lot to talk about here. Similar to the Cleric, which had 3 subclasses which stood out above all the others, I think there are 3 Wizard subclasses which stand out. And they are Abjuration, Evocation, and Divination. Ultimately, I think Divination Wizard is probably the best. This is the control element of the wizard. It gets this very strong portent ability, which allows you to guarantee the rolls on certain d20 rolls. Very, very good from a control perspective and just from a general honor mode perspective. Anytime you can guarantee a roll, that's always going to be good if you're not reloading. And that's why Divination Wizards are the best in my opinion. But these other 2 are kind of more fun for me and also really good. Abjuration Wizard gets a really strong defensive ability, Arcane Ward. If you cast Abjuration spells, which you're always doing on every wizard with Counterspell and Glyph of Warding, You can build up stacks of Arcane Ward, which mitigate damage to yourself and also to allies. And if you slot this wizard into an already pretty tanky team comp, like maybe one with Oath of Ancients Paladin and a Life Cleric, what you have is just so much durability, you end up being able to go longer without taking a long rest. And yeah, that's just really good. And then finally we get to Evocation Wizard, which has been my favorite ever since patch 5. Evocation Wizard is the offensive-oriented version of the wizard. You get to add your intelligence modifier to the damage of your evocation spells late game. This is particularly good on Eldritch Blast, Magic Missile, and amazing on Curriculum of Strategy. You can cast like Cone of Cold over allies, and the allies won't take damage, and that is very valuable. For the rest of the wizards, they're all still good because they're wizards. Sorry, I just looked this up and I got this wrong. This is actually Illusion. This is Divination. I had that backwards. So there's kind of a middle of the pack on the remaining ones too, which for me is Enchantment. I believe that's this one. I would probably put Enchantment. Yeah, I think here's safe. And then also Necromancy. I think these have their niche. Enchantment gets to cast enchantment spells twinned for free late game, which can be very good with like Hold Monster and stuff. Necromancy gets boosted summons, making it the summoner wizard and extremely good on a summoning comp, which is a fun niche composition. That's enough to make it stand out for me. Conjuration, Illusion, and Transmutation. I would probably put Conjuration as the best. They get some interesting abilities that end up kind of being difficult to build around. The main one is that late game, when they are concentrating on a Conjuration spell, they are immune to concentration checks. So which Conjuration spell do you want to be concentrating on? I don't know. It's tough to say. There's not a ton of really good options, but most of them are like area of control damage spells, like Cloud of Daggers. And so if you wanted to build around Cloud of Daggers, which can be worth doing, it's not an elite composition, but it's a good one, Conjuration Wizard's probably the way to go for that. Then we get to Transmutation. I would put it second. It does get some pretty good abilities, like it brews double potions. I actually ban brew potions in my runs, but if you don't, it's really good for that. And then it gets like a Philosopher's Stone ability, which can buff casters. Basically, it will save like a caster a feat is what you use it for. And so it can be good for that. And then Illusion, I find Illusion just doesn't have a lot of uses. It technically can cast Minor Illusion as a bonus action in combat, which can allow you to do very corny things with like hiding and abusing Cones of Vision. But to me, like I said, it just feels corny to me. Some people really like it and have a lot of fun with it, so I get that. So that is it. That is all the subclasses, and that is it for this video. This has been a long one. I hope not too long. I will catch you next time.